the political side of it, and then there's the real story.
There's a lot to unpack right there. It wasn't quite the interview I thought that was going to be.
There's a reason for it.
This will be officially my favorite podcast I've ever done.
This morning for the country's most famous political dynasty.
RFK Jr. plans
Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
independent
the presidential
on
race
October 9th in the state
that it's time to heal a divided nation and return the power to the people.
Robert Kennedy Jr.
And so I've come here today to declare our independence from the tyranny of corruption, which robs us of affordable lives, our belief in the future, and our respect for each other. But to do that, I must first declare my own independence. Independence from the Democratic Party and from all other political parties. I haven't made this decision lightly. It's very painful for me to let go of the party of my uncles, my father, my grandfather, and both of my great-grandfathers. But my sacrifice is nothing compared to the risk our founding fathers took when they signed the Declaration of Independence 247 years ago. They knew that if their revolution failed, every last one of them would be hanged. They chose to place everything on the line. When John Adams put his pen down after adding his signature to the Declaration, he turned to those present and he said to them, sink or swim, live or die, survive or perish. From this day on, I am with my country.
My mom would freak out if she saw this. So we asked a small group of people to be here tonight so we could, ask some of the most important people in my life to help with the campaign. And I thought one of the most articulate things I've seen ever said about the current state of what's happening with Russia and NATO. And I wondered if you could just elaborate any further on the comments you made at the conference about what's happening in the Middle East and the Ukraine.
Well, those are two very big and different subjects, but Ukraine, I'm against wars, but there are necessary and just wars, and then there are wars of choice. And what I would say is that most of the wars that we've been involved in over the past 100 years have been wars of choice that we shouldn't have been involved in. And in fact, I would say the only war that was not a war of choice was World War II. World War I was a war of choice we shouldn't have gone over. We shouldn't have been involved. My grandfather was a very, very big advocate at that time for staying out of that war. He lost a lot of friendships. But Ukraine is a war of choice. It's a war, I'm not excusing Putin. Putin did not need to go into Ukraine. His invasion of Ukraine is illegal. But we need to understand that the comic book depictions that we are fed by the media and by government agencies are just that. And it's the same thing that we got during the Iraq War when we were told that Saddam Hussein had bombed the World Trade Center, that he had orchestrated the anthrax attacks, and it all turned out to be, and that he had weapons of mass destruction. And that's why we needed to go in there. We ended up destroying one of the most important countries in the Mideast. It was the principal bulwark strategically against the Iranian expansion. And Iran, as a result of our intervention in the war, killed 1 million Iraqis, more Iraqis than Saddam Hussein ever killed. We killed during that war, and we pushed Iraq into a proxy posture with Iran. And that actually is what is the etiology of the Gaza attacks, and the Hezbollah and the Yemen attacks are all because now we unleashed Gaza, we unleashed Iran on the rest of the world. There's a Shia majority in Iraq, and Saddam Hussein was holding them in check. And as soon as he was eliminated, his followers went and created ISIS and then started another civil war in Syria, which drove 6 million refugees up to Europe, destabilized all the Western democracies in Europe, created Brexit as a direct result of that war. The riots that are going on in France today are the direct result of ultimately the Iraq war. It cost us $8 trillion. So, and each time we're given these comic book depictions that there's a supervillain who's about to do something terrible and attack the world, and that we need to stop him, and that we're fighting for democracy. And we need to be more skeptical about that, because we've got a lot of apparatus in our country, the intelligence, the military apparatus, and what Eisenhower warned us against, the military-industrial complex, that has created this system of captured the agencies, the CIA and the agencies of government, and deployed them to provide us with a continuous pipeline of new wars. So I'll briefly summarize a contrasting narrative to what we hear about Ukraine. And that story begins in 1992 when the Berlin Wall came down. Gorbachev did something very courageous, which made it so that he really could never even go back to Russia. His funeral was there, but it wasn't even attended by any government officials. And he did something which was to allow East and West Germany to align under one government, and then to remove 450,000 Soviet troops and allow NATO troops, an adversarial army, to move into their bases and their barracks. And Gorbachev said, I'm going to do this. He went to Bush, he went to John Major in England and said, I'm going to dismantle the Soviet Union, but I want one promise from you, that you will not move NATO to the east. James Baker, who was then the Secretary of State, famously said, we will not move NATO 1 inch to the east. And then in 1997, a group of neocons took over a government led by Zbigniew Brzezinski during the Clinton era, and they came up with a plan, published a plan, and said, we're going to move NATO right up to the Russian borders, 1,000 miles to the east, into 15 countries. Why do they want to do that? Well, one of the major reasons is that every time you move NATO into a new country, that new nation has to conform its weapons purchases to NATO's specifications, which means it has to buy virtually all of its weapons from Raytheon, General Dynamics, Boeing, Lockheed, and Northrop Grumman. And those are the biggest contributors to Congress. And so you have both political parties, the Republicans and Democrats, who are being encouraged to constantly move NATO into these countries, and then all the think tanks in Washington that provide these generals to go speak on CNN and Fox and everybody else. And if you see who they're really working for, they're all funded by those groups, the guys who go up on CNN and say, yeah, Putin's a terrible threat, he wants to invade all of Europe. They're working for arms manufacturers. So when Brzezinski, during the Clinton administration, made this proposal, George Kennan, who is our principal, most famous, deified American diplomat, he was the architect of the containment policy during the Cold War. He said, this is insane. He said, if you move NATO to the east, you're going to force a Soviet response, a violent response. And he said, why aren't we doing to Russia? They lost the Cold War. We defeated them. Why aren't we acting the same generous victors that we did after World War II and make a Marshall Plan and integrate them into Europe? And Bill Pierce, who was then the Secretary of Defense, now he's the head of the CIA, but he said he was going to resign if we went forward because it was so dangerous, so reckless. Bill Perry, who was the U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union, also threatened to resign and said, this is the craziest idea ever. Well, we went ahead and we did it. And we moved NATO into 14 countries, and we walked away simultaneously during the Trump administration, the Obama administration, from the 2 nuclear missiles treaties that we had with the Soviet Union that forbade intermediate range nuclear missiles. So we said we're walking unilaterally. The Russians didn't want to do it, but we did it, and then we put Aegis missile systems, which are Lockheed systems, which are launch the nuclear Tomahawk weapons in Romania and Poland, 12 minutes from the Kremlin. So in 12 minutes, we could decapitate the entire Kremlin leadership. And that is destabilizing to the region. And the Russians were screaming and saying, well, whatever you do, a red line for us is Ukraine. You cannot put NATO into Ukraine. And so then in 2014, the CIA spends $5 billion to overthrow the democratically elected government of Ukraine. This was a government that was trying to stay neutral. And we overthrew them. And a month before that, Victoria Nuland, who's the king of the neocons now and is the Deputy Secretary of State, made a telephone call to the U.S. Embassy in Kiev that was recorded. So that recording, any of you can go and listen to it. And she picked, a month before the coup, the entire Ukrainian cabinet that we were going to install. We overthrew the democratically elected government of the Ukraine. We installed our own government in Ukraine, sympathetic to the United States. That government immediately, the first day, passed a law against the Russian language. Half the people in Ukraine are Russian speaking. So in Donbass, Lugansk, and Crimea. And forbidding a lot of other cultural manifestations for those groups. So they began protesting, and the Kiev government began firing on them and killed 14,000 of them. And Donbass and Lugansk then vote to join Russia. 90-10, 9-1. And Putin says, I don't want them in Russia. I want them to stay part of Ukraine, but let's make sure they're protected. Let's do a treaty. So he negotiated a treaty with Britain, France, and England, and Russia, and Germany, called the Minsk Accords. The Minsk Accords did 3 things. 1, it denazified the new Ukrainian government. 2, there were 4 ministers of that government that were ultra-nationalists, and that's a very nice description of them. It also gave independent, it made Ukraine or Donbass and Lugansk quasi-autonomous regions in Russia, like Quebec is in Canada, where they could continue to speak their own language and protect their people. Most importantly, it forbade Ukraine from going into NATO. And so then in 2019, this young actor and comedian, Vladimir Zelensky, runs for president. He's never had anything to do with politics. He had a popular TV show. Do you know what that TV show is about? It was about a comedian who becomes president of the Ukraine. He then runs for president of the Ukraine, and his only issue is that peace, that he's going to sign the Minsk Accords. And he wins with 70% of the vote, a landslide, because everybody wants peace in Ukraine. He gets in there and immediately pivots and says, I'm not going to sign it. And that's when Russia went into Crimea, because Putin, and you put yourself in his shoes, which my uncle, President Kennedy, always said you got to do, just how he stayed out of going to war with Khrushchev during the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Citizens, this government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere.
And he understood that that Putin knew that if that U.S. government, puppet government, invited the U.S. Navy into Sevastopol, which is the Soviet port for 347 years, has been the only warm water port that Russia has. And okay, now the U.S. Navy is going to go in there, so he goes into Crimea without firing a shot. The Crimean people welcome him as a liberator, and they take over Crimea. And he sends 40,000 troops into Ukraine because they say they're not going to sign the Minsk Accords. And we say, oh, look, he's moving to take over Europe. It's 40,000 troops. He doesn't intend to take over Ukraine. Ukraine has a population of 44 million people. What he said at that time is, I just want them back at the negotiating table. He goes to the negotiating table in April of 2022, and the U.S. will not help Zelensky. He wants to end the war. So he goes to Naftali Bennett, who's the prime minister of Israel, and Erdogan, who's the prime minister of Turkey, and says, will you help me negotiate peace with the Russians? And they say, yeah. They negotiate a peace agreement, which is called Minsk II. It basically does the same thing. And Zelensky initials it, the Russians initial it, and Putin begins withdrawing his troops. It does the same thing. It says you can't bring NATO into Ukraine. And President Biden then sends Boris Johnson over and forces Zelensky to tear up that agreement. Now, how do we know that? How do we know that happened? Here's how we know. All of the negotiators have now come clean, including Naftali Bennett, and you can go on YouTube and look at his speech. The Ukrainian negotiators, the Russian negotiators, the Turkish negotiators have all said that's exactly what happened. So, and that month, April, President Lloyd Austin, who's the Secretary of Defense, is asked, why are we in Ukraine? And he says, we're in Ukraine to degrade the Russian army and exhaust its capacity to fight anywhere else in the world. So that's not about Ukrainian people. It's about a geopolitical proxy war with Russia. And President Biden, when he was asked that month, why are we in Ukraine? His answer was regime change for Vladimir Putin. Well, that also, and by the way, that also is not for the good of the Ukrainian people. It's a U.S. geopolitical objective. And by the way, this war has just done just the opposite. It's made Russia much more economically independent, economically robust. It's created BRICS, which is a huge threat to the American dollar. It's exposed America as a paper tiger. And it has rocketed Putin's popularity in Russia to the highest apex of his career. Oh, it's not, and then it's pushed Russia into an alliance with China, which is probably the worst geopolitical outcome that we could imagine. So it's a bad war. It was a war of choice, not excusing Putin, but we need to understand our role in provoking that war.
So that right there is the reason why I think he's the most important political candidate in today's times. You guys have to understand what he just said, the articulation of what he said, being able to make us all understand what has happened here. As someone who is part, unfortunately, of the industrial complex, who owns a defense business, I will tell you that this is the most troubling thing. When I listened to what Bobby said about this, it resonates to me about how important you are and how are you important to the country. And so I want to transition, which I thought was amazing. You really have one of the most amazing understandings of geopolitical politics I've ever seen, ever heard. Just really amazing. And we got to get this message out to people. that there is a different choice here. And I want to ask about your path to the presidency. I think that, how does it happen? How do you see yourself getting there? I've seen some things about getting 5% from certain areas, battleground states and stuff. Can you articulate to everybody how you see a path to be the president?
Yeah, I mean, we have 9 months now, and as you pointed out before, the Quinnipiac poll showed me in the 6 battleground states, I'm beating President Trump and President Biden with all Americans under 45. And the Harvard-Harris poll shows me winning in people under 35. It confirms that, but it did under 35 in all across the country. Both polls also show me dominating the field in independents. Oh, independents are the biggest cohort. This would be the first election in history where the independent people who are self-identified independents outnumber Republicans and Democrats. And so, I'm winning in those, and that's with my really only publicity has been podcasts and, long-form interviews on I would say non-conventional sources. So in the mainstream media, I get nothing but bad publicity. And they will not let me do live interviews. So tonight, on Saturday, I had my first live interview on mainstream media on Michael Smerconish. Tonight, I had my first live interview. It's not live, but live to tape with NBC, and it was actually a very fair interview. And what I think is going to happen is that because of my poll numbers, that wall of resistance to me that just will not allow me on mainstream media is breaking. The only demographic that I really lose in is the demographic I ought to actually do best in, which is baby boomers. So, thank you. And they, I think the reason for that is that cohort gets its news from ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, and MSNBC. And then the New York Times and the Washington Post, and if that is the information bubble, if I was living in that ecosystem, I would have a very low opinion of myself. Because, all they do is say I'm a quack, I'm a anti-Semite, racist, all of these just things that are designed to cancel me, to shut my mouth, and that, I'm anti-science, I'm a baby killer, all of this stuff. And then when people actually see me talking on these, I'm called, incidentally, an anti-Semite at the same time I'm being called a Zionist. Oh, it's like a disconnect. But, what I am hoping is that when they start seeing me in longer form interviews, that, and what we see is, kids come up to us all the time and say, my parents hated you, I love you, I made them watch the Joe Rogan podcast, and they converted in 10 minutes. And so our challenge is to get old people to watch a podcast, which they don't, know how to do. My son, incidentally, I have a 28-year-old son, Connor, and I said to him, have you ever seen an evening news program? And Connor went to Harvard, he's very well informed. He actually went over and fought in the Ukraine, on the side of the Ukrainians, and he fought in the Kharkiv offensive. He had, lots of firefights with the Russians, but he's very well educated and very well informed. And I said, have you ever seen an evening news show in your life? And he was like, nope, never. So that generation is living in a completely different place, in terms of information intake, and people who are in my generation. And I think it's a beautiful thing, actually, because this is kind of off the subject, but my kids grew up in the, swipe right age, and they have no attention. And I'd say, you have the attention of a lightning bug, And, but they will sit for 3 hours and listen to Jordan Peterson or Joe Rogan or Aubrey Marcus or Lex Friedman, and it's pretty extraordinary. That whole generation is like that. And those are the people I'm doing well with. So my challenge is to get this other. Now, I'll just say this. In the most recent round of the best polling, I'm at 20 to 24. Michigan, I'm at 27. Technically, all I need to do, if it's a three-way tie, is to get to 34. So I only need 4.5 points from each of those other candidates over the next 9 months, and I've been gaining about a point a month. So it's within, and I would win decisively if I get if I get up to 40 percentage points, because nobody can, because it's winner take all. The last thing I would say to you is that even if I got only 33 electoral votes, which is just a couple of states, one really big state, based upon past performance, neither side would be able to win the election, because none of them would get 270 electoral votes, which you need. What happens then? It goes to a contingent election where the Senate chooses the vice president and the House chooses the president, but in a weird metrics. Each state gets one vote. Normally you would say that means President Trump will be president because Republicans outnumber Democrats by nine states. But in fact, neither of them, under the 12th Amendment, you need 26 votes to win, and neither of them can get that. And no Democrat is ever going to vote for Donald Trump, because their career's over. No Republican is ever going to vote for Joe Biden, because their career is over. They can't go home if they do that. And so they're going to almost certainly have to find a compromise candidate. And they're not allowed to do any other business until they settle it. And because my popularity, or many Republicans who are voting for Trump, if they're asked in poll after poll, who is your second choice? They don't say Ron DeSantis. They don't say Nikki Haley. They say me. And that's true with a lot of Democrats too. And so I'm the most, so anyway, I think I have a path to victory from a number of different, options.
I think you do too. I think you do too. Hey, I wanted to say earlier when I started this, I said the path to victory for Bobby makes sense. It seems like, I'm one of those people who used to say, everyone says this is the most important election. Every presidential candidate says the most important election. You hear that a lot. But this is one of those times where I've come over to the other side and think that this is one of the most important elections ever, if not the most important, right? Nothing's more important. The last breath was great, but the next breath is the most important. And I'm wondering, when you become president, how do you fix what seems to be like a really divided, crazy, if you have a mask, the whole thing is bizarre to me. And I wonder how you heal the country in the sense of getting everyone to at least have some common ground.
Yeah, that's what I promised 9 months ago when I declared in Boston that, our country is now at a level of polarization that's probably the worst since the American Civil War. When I was a kid in 1968, when my dad ran, it was similarly divided. There were riots that burned down 127 cities. There were, kids being killed by soldiers on our campuses. There were buildings being blown up by the Weather Underground, et cetera. So it's been divided before. What I said is that my job during my campaign and during the 8 years of my presidency is to end that rancor and focus on the values that we all share in common as Americans, rather than these culture war issues that are that are being used to keep us apart. And what I've found since starting this campaign is that those landscapes that are occupied by the things that we all feel strongly about are much, much larger than the little issues that, the guns, the abortion, the border, et cetera, which are all important. And climate, it's much larger, and I'll give you some examples. By the way, I have supporters who are pro, Second Amendment absolutists and people who are pro-gun control. I have abortion and pro-life supporters. I have vaccinated people and anti-vax. So people are willing to accept a candidate who does not agree with them on every issue, but is respectful of them, is willing to listen, has an open mind, and can demonstrate again and again that he can be persuaded by different points of view that are outside of these ideological lockstep. And on the border, I saw the border, I went there, and my position switched diametrically because I saw what was happening, 4 or 5 months ago. And there's many issues like that. So what I found is everybody in this country agrees that veterans ought to be taken care of. At the PTSD, we ought to make that a priority. The wives of veterans should not be eating, and their families should not be eating at soup kitchens. They have to be a priority. Everybody wants a good education system in our country. And we can do that. We need school choice so that the marketplace will allow parents to choose the best educational options for their kids and reward the schools that are doing a good job. And make the schools again the servants of children and their parents. Everybody wants, and nobody likes the idea that the Mexican drug cartels are running U.S. border policy and that there's 7 million people who've come in illegally in 3 years. Nobody likes that. Everybody now sees that it's crushing the social service systems in New York and all these other cities. Every city in this country is now a border city, and they're getting swamped and destroyed. New York City recently cut firefighters by 5%, police by 5%, healthcare by 5%, education by 5% in order to pay for the cost of servicing this influx. 110,000 migrants who've come in. Everybody wants to protect the environment in this country. If the only thing that you're willing to talk about is climate change, and you're going to have a fist fight. If you want to talk about clean air, clean water, regenerative agriculture, ending toxic exposure to our children, protecting wildlife, protecting our sacred places, everybody knows there's no such thing as Republican children or Democratic children. And when I was leading the battle in Flint, Michigan to get the lead out of the water, we had Hell's Angels standing shoulder to shoulder with urban blacks. And the same thing at Standing Rock, because we didn't sell it as a climate issue. We said it's about protecting a sacred place. And we had Republicans, Democrats, business, labor, everybody come to that. And it's the way that we talk about these issues, and we talk about it in a way that appeals to the highest ideals of our country. Everybody wants to end the chronic disease epidemic. No politician is talking about it. The cost of diabetes now in this country, of treating it, is now bigger than our defense budget. 30% of kids now have diabetes. When I was a kid, a pediatrician would see one diabetic kid in his lifetime. And now it's 1 out of every 3 kids who walks through his office. Nobody's asking about why this is happening. 50 to 60% of adults have diabetes. And the Alzheimer epidemic is related to diabetes. Virtually everybody who has Alzheimer's has a diabetes diagnosis. And scientists, Todd and I were talking about this earlier, scientists and researchers are now classifying diabetes as Alzheimer's as type 3 diabetes. Oh, this is about cellular deregulation, and it's happening because we're poisoning an entire generation with bad food, with processed foods, with neonicotinoids, with atrazine. The 4% of our GDP went to healthcare when my uncle was president. Today, 20% does. It's $4.3 trillion. Our entire defense budget, including national security, veterans, everything is $1.3 trillion. Healthcare is $4.3 trillion, and 93% of Medicare claims are for chronic disease. 6% of kids had chronic disease when my uncle was president, 60% today. Nobody's saying anything. All these autoimmune diseases, which I never heard of, rheumatoid arthritis, juvenile diabetes, these exotic illnesses like Crohn's disease, lupus. I have a lot of young people in my audience. Almost all of them have something. It's hard to find a young person who does not have one. Neurodevelopmental disorders, ADD, ADHD, speech delay, language delay, tics, Tourette syndrome, ASD, autism. Our kids are all on Adderall. They're all on SSRIs, 40%. Benzos. Why? Doctors didn't just start prescribing these for no reason. We have damaged this entire generation. We have poisoned them. And the autism rates have gone from 1 in 10,000 in my generation, 70-year-old men. 1 in 10,000 of people my age has autism. And I'm talking full-blown autism, not, your quirky uncle with, Asperger's. I'm talking about nonverbal, non-toilet trained, head banging, stimming, toe walking, hand flapping, all of these, characteristic tactile and light sensitivities. People like that, 1 in 10,000 in my generation. 1 in every 34 kids in my kids' generation. 1 in every 22 boys. The military can't recruit kids anymore. They're so badly damaged. And it's bankrupting our country, and it's rising exponentially, and nobody is mentioning it. And we have a medical cartel, which are regulatory agencies, the pharmaceutical companies, the doctors, hospitals, which are all owned by hedge funds, are now making a killing on chronic disease. And the sicker we get, the richer they get. The insurance industry. The sicker we are, the richer they are. And nobody is saying anything. No, not one presidential candidate ever mentions this. It's the biggest issue. And nobody's debating it. Your kids are all affected. You cannot find a kid in this country who's not affected. And nobody's talking about it. And I'm going to fix it. And I know exactly how to fix it. Oh.
Wow, that's powerful. I saw Bill Maher over the weekend basically called Joe Biden a liar, saying Congress had to give him some document to save the border. I don't know what the document was. He basically called him a liar. What is the solution? I mean, in the shortest way you can about the border. It seems to be that it's playing right into what Trump talks about. I mean, this was his agenda item the first time, and it's become like the most insane looking thing happening, right? And I think Jason keeps me up on this. We gave $53 million away in credit cards to illegals over the weekend. What's the solution here?
Yeah. Oh, and the question of why it's happening is baffling to me. I mean, the least kind of a bad motive, ulterior motive, is that it's just political pettiness. It's a new administration that came in and wanted to do the opposite of what Trump was doing. But it makes no sense. And going down there was eye-opening for me. I watched 300 people come in 2 hours. The first 110 were from West, young men, military age, all from West Africa. I expected to see, people from Salvador and Nicaragua, but I didn't see any of them. There was only, the whole night, there was only 2 people from Latin or Central America, one from Peru and one from Colombia, and the rest of them were from Asia and Africa. And, a lot of them from China, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Nepal, Tibet, India, Bangladesh, China. And they all said to me, I interviewed 110 of them, and they all said, except for 2 who had asylum claims, every other one said, I'm here for a job. Well, that's not legal. There's not even any part of that that's legal. If you want a job, you come in the legal way. And they all had TikTok, and they knew exactly what was going to happen to them. The Border Patrol fingerprints them. If they don't have the criminal record, the Border Patrol takes them to the airport, to Yuma Airport, puts them on a plane to any destination they choose. If they don't have the money for the flight, the Border Patrol pays it and gets reimbursement from FEMA. 7 million people. It's crazy. How do you fix it? It's easy. First of all, you plug the 27 gaps in the wall. You don't need a wall from Brownsville, 2,200 miles from Brownsville, Texas to San Diego, but you do need the wall in the urban areas where migrants can disappear in seconds. You need a big physical barrier. And then in the countryside, you need fences, you need access roads, and you need monitoring equipment. And in fact, that stuff was all up there, and the Biden administration literally took it down. They had sensors, they had long-range cameras, they had videos, they had night lights, and it was all removed. And that just opened up this flow. And then what you need to do is reinstate the Migrant Protection Act, which says that people who come to Mexico with an asylum claim from other countries, that they can't come in, that they have to have their asylum claim adjudicated while they remain in Mexico. And that you need to talk to the Mexican government, but they agreed to it before, they'll agree again if we didn't have such bad relationships with them. We need asylum judges at the border to adjudicate the cases there, and we need more Border Patrol, and we need to give respect to the Border Patrol. The Border Patrol is very, very demoralized. And they're wrongly vilified. And people don't want to work there anymore because they're so badly vilified. There's 9 of them that have committed suicide. A lot of them were military veterans. They're people who wanted to spend their lives serving our country, and we need to treat them with respect and with admiration and let them do their jobs. And I would say this very quickly. I'm going to do something on day 1, which is I'm going to order the post office and the State Department to issue passport cards to every American that says they can't afford them for free. A passport card is available at any post office in this country if you show proof of citizenship. Now, that's going to do 3 things. There's tens of millions of Americans who do not have a government-issued photo ID. Who are they? They're almost all Democrats. And they're minorities in our cities who don't need a driver's license. They're students who haven't qualified for a driver's license, and they're elderly for whom their licenses have expired. They're Democratic base. That's why Democrats don't like it when Republicans say you have to have a voter ID to vote. As the Democrats say, our guys don't have voter IDs. And nobody wants to go and sit with the sadists at the DMV to get a license just to vote for however long it takes. You all know what that nightmare. At least I know what that nightmare is like. And if you don't have a license in this country, 3 things happen. 1. You are a second-class citizen. You can't open a bank account, you can't get on an airplane, you can't visit your kid at school, you can't check into a hotel. You can't get a bank account, which means that 10% of your Social Security check and your salary are going to check cashers, which is, so being poor makes you poor. Number 2, one of the big sources of tensions between Republicans and Democrats there's this photo ID dispute at the voting booth. Well, we've gotten the civil rights leadership, Andrew Young, Al Sharpton, and many others, to agree that if I issue this voter ID, that they will withdraw their objection to the requirement of a voter ID to vote. So everybody can get it, nobody's got an excuse, and we can now at the voting booth say, show us your ID. Number three, right now it's illegal for an employer to employ a illegal alien, but there's a loophole. The only box they have to check is that they saw a Social Security card. Well, the Social Security card has no picture on it. It's easily fabricated and forged. And in New York, at the construction sites, they're notoriously passed hand to hand so that the employer can check the box and then he pays everybody in cash and that's it. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, in order to employ somebody in this country, you need to see a government-issued photo ID. And that will shut down the border overnight. Because all of those people I talk to coming across the border said, I'm here for a job. If everybody in the world knows you cannot get a job, and if the employer's going to go to jail now if he doesn't check your ID, so they're not going to do it anymore. And if everybody in the world knows you cannot get a job in the United States of America unless you have a government-issued photo ID and you're a citizen, then they're going to stop coming across the border. I'll say this last thing. During the last decade of his life, I worked very closely with Cesar Chavez. Cesar Chavez was, one of my father's closest allies. And during the last 10 or 20 years of his life, and I was so close to him that his family asked me to be his pallbearer, one of his pallbearers, when he died in 1993. But during the last 20 years of his life, he had two priority issues. One of them was pesticides, and that's why I was working with him, because Hispanic farm workers are disproportionately injured by pesticide exposure. The other big issue he had was closing the border, because he understood at his capacity to leverage good wages and salaries and conditions for his workers was being diminished by the influx of workers that were coming across the border illegally, and was giving the growers the ability to hire illegals very, very easily and cheaply. So, this is a humanitarian issue. And it's not a good, I saw what happened to the people at the border. They had been beaten, they had been extorted, they had been exploited. Some of them had been raped. I visited a rape center in Yuma, specially designed for children, because the number of people, the cartels extract the final payment just before. In fact, there was a tree called the final payment tree, where these rapes take place all the time. And it's children and women, and I talked to people whose entire life savings was robbed, they were robbed. And then they come to this country and they can't work. They're given an asylum date 7 years from now and they can't work. And they end up, in New York City on the street, sleeping on the sidewalk and taking jobs from unscrupulous employers at $7, $8, $9, $10, $11 an hour. And it's not a life. And, it's not good for anybody.
Everybody, Bobby Kennedy, please. Stand up for Bobby Kennedy.
We must recognize the full human equality of all of our people, not just to those of a particular religion, not just to those of a particular race, not just to the wealthy, but to all of the people. We must do it for the single and fundamental reason that it is the right thing to do.